It's the early morning of July 14th, 1966, in the Jeffrey Manor neighborhood of Chicago, Illinois. Jeffrey Manor was an area in South Chicago that had once been used as a waste site for industrial byproducts. But that changed in the 1940s when it was cleaned up and residential housing was built. The homes in the area were primarily duplexes or standalone townhouses. And some of these townhouses functioned as dormitories for many young nursing students who attended the nearby South Chicago Community Hospital School of Nursing. Young women from all over the country came to study nursing at this school, and they had to adhere to some pretty strict rules if they wanted to be part of the program. Their uniforms were to be spotless, they were not allowed to wear any nail polish, makeup, or jewelry, and any marriages or pregnancies would result in their expulsion. According to the Chicago Tribune, one student described the nursing school as a cross between a convent and a boot camp. But despite its restrictions, the girls who attended were dedicated to the school. And the Chicago Tribune described it as a place where young women laughed, hugged, studied, ate, and teased each other's hair, as was the fashion in the 1960s. One of these young nursing students was a woman named Judy Dytok. At around 6 a.m. the morning of July 14th, Judy wakes up in her dorm room to a strange noise. At first, she believes it's a child outside her building screaming. But then she realizes the screams are coming from the other nursing dorm across the street. The townhouse across from hers was home to 8 other nursing students, all young women in their 20s, many of which were Judy's friends. When she hears the screams, Judy throws on her robe and makes her way outside. Once on the street, she can see a fellow nursing student leaning out on the ledge of a second-story window. At the top of her lungs, the young woman is screaming, "My friends are all dead. I'm the only one alive. Oh God, I'm the only one alive." This is the story of the Chicago nurse murders. Hi strangers, this is your host Alexa Morrissey, and today's story is a gruesome one, and it's been called the crime of the century by some. It's a shocking case, not only because of the horrible violence that occurred, but also because of the seemingly random nature of the crime. It's a story that will have you question whether or not you're safer home alone or surrounded by friends. Because while there is power in numbers, sometimes it just results in more victims. Lock your doors and listen closely. This is Stranger in the House. "52-year-old Robert Hall, a foreman for a local steel mill, is out walking his dog early the morning of July 14th in Chicago when he hears someone screaming from the second floor of a townhouse across the street. As he goes to see if he can help the screaming woman, 2 other women run out of the house from a back entrance. Judy Dytok, the young nursing student from across the street, entered the house after she heard her classmates screaming and had discovered a gruesome scene. Judy ran back to the dorm to get the house mother, Mrs. Bizon, and after checking out the scene again, they went outside and told Mr. Hall that several people had been murdered in the dorm and he needed to go get the police. Mr. Hall ran down the street and flagged down a passing squad car driven by a 26-year-old patrolman named Daniel Kelly, who had only been on the job for about 18 months. Mr. Hall told Officer Kelly what had been discovered, and Kelly immediately called the South Chicago District Station to send backup. Before we get into the crime scene, I want to give you an idea of the townhome's layout. As mentioned before, 8 young women lived in the house. It was a 2-story townhome with a living room, half bath, and a kitchen on the first floor. And the only phone in the house was on a wall in the kitchen. The kitchen was at the back of the house, and it had a door that led to a rear alley. The women more often used this door to enter the house rather than the front door, as it's where their shuttle to the hospital would often drop them off. On the second floor, there was one bathroom and 3 bedrooms, which consisted of a mix of single and bunked beds. Officer Kelly, the patrolman that Mr. Hall flagged down, is the first to arrive at the townhouse. He sees that Judy and her house mother are consoling the young woman who had been screaming out the window that morning, 23-year-old Corazon Amaru. Corazon was an extremely petite young woman who had come from the Philippines to study nursing. Corazon was hysterical, and through her sobs, she said that all her friends had been murdered by a man who broke into the house last night. She begs the officer not to go into the townhouse because her attacker might still be in there. Judy told the officer that she went to check out why Corazon was screaming that morning and found 8 women dead inside the house, covered in so much blood that they were unrecognizable to her. With his gun at the ready, Officer Kelly tries the front door of the townhouse, but finds it locked. He walks around to the rear alley and discovers that the back door is unlocked. He enters the house and finds himself in the kitchen. He slowly walks through, aware that the perpetrator or perpetrators could still be somewhere in the house. When he gets to the living room, he is horrified by what he sees. The carpet is soaked in blood, so much so that it pools over his shoes when he steps onto it. On the couch, lying face down, is a completely naked woman, who is obviously dead due to the fact that her skin is blue. The 26-year-old officer runs out of the house and waits for backup. Soon, the street is filled with police officers, and the townhouse is roped off. When Detective Jack Wallenda arrives, he goes through the house and assesses the scene. A quick warning: the details of this crime scene are quite gruesome, so listener discretion is advised for the next few minutes. In the living room, Detective Wallenda finds a 22-year-old nursing student, Gloria Davey, lying face down on a couch. She is naked, and semen is clearly on her backside. There are buttons from her shirt scattered all around the room, suggesting that it had been torn off of her. Marks on her neck also suggested that she had been strangled to death. On the floor of the living room is a white men's t-shirt, size 30 to 40. Gloria is the only victim downstairs, so Detective Wallenda makes his way upstairs. In one bedroom, lying on a bed, he finds 20-year-old Pamela Wilkening, gagged with a stab wound to the heart. Nearby, 21-year-old Suzanne Ferris is lying in a pool of her own blood. White stockings have been tied around her neck, and the detective counts 18 stab wounds on her chest and neck. On the floor near Suzanne, he finds 20-year-old Mary Ann Jordan, who had 3 stab wounds to her chest and 1 in the neck. In the next bedroom, 24-year-old Nina Schmale was found with her nightgown pulled up above her chest and her legs spread. She had been tied up, stabbed, and police observed that her neck looked broken. In that same room, it seemed as though 2 girls were piled on top of each other. At the bottom is 23-year-old Valentina Payson. She is face down with her throat cut and covered with a blue blanket. Carelessly thrown on top of her was 23-year-old Merlita Gargiulo, who appeared to be both strangled and stabbed. To the right of the bedrooms was the bathroom, where Detective Wallenda saw 20-year-old Patricia Matusik's legs through the doorway. She lay on her back with her hands tied behind her. She appeared to have been strangled with a ripped bedsheet, and her nightgown was also pulled above her chest, and her underwear was pulled down. Bloody towels littered the floor surrounding her. Detective Jack Wallenda described it as the worst crime scene he had ever witnessed. And that makes sense because this was one of the most horrific crime scenes in Chicago's history. And while police were traumatized by what they saw, they also had hope. Because they had an eyewitness that could help them bring these girls the justice they deserved. Corazon Amaru was still on the front porch, completely distraught over the events she had witnessed. So much so that she was eventually sedated and taken to the hospital by paramedics. Because of her traumatized state, she wasn't able to give a full report of what happened the night before. But before she was taken to the hospital, she gave police a decent description of the man who attacked the nurses. She said he was a tall white male in his mid-20s, and he had a tattoo on his arm that read, "Born to Raise Hell." By the late morning of July 14th, police worked with a sketch artist to render a picture of their suspect, and then they released it along with the information about his tattoo to the media. With the horrific news of the murders spreading quickly throughout the city, and the sketch circulating through the public, police immediately started to receive tips about their suspect. A nearby gas station worker recalled his manager telling him a story about an angry man who matched the description coming into the store the day before. He said that the man was complaining about missing some sort of job on a ship. With this information, the police thought they were possibly looking for someone without a job. So they went to the local hiring hall and questioned the staff there. An agent at the hiring hall looked at the police sketch and said that he did in fact see a man who resembled the sketch the day before. He remembered the man because of how angry he was when he found out that his job had been double booked, and the other guy who showed up first got it. When the police ask for a name, the agent goes through the trash and manages to find the old assignment sheet. On the crumpled piece of paper read the name, Richard Speck. Richard Speck was born on December 6, 1941, in Kirkwood, Illinois. He was one of 8 children, born to a very religious mother and father. Richard's father died when he was around 6 years old, and his mother remarried 3 years later. When Richard was young, he suffered a head injury from falling out of a tree. And while many people have injuries as a child and don't grow up to be murderers, an interesting study conducted by the University of Glasgow and published in the Journal of Violent and Aggressive Behavior stated that out of 239 killers in the study, about 21% of them had a definite or suspected head injury during childhood. From a young age, Richard suffered from serious pockmarks on his face. He was so insecure about how he looked that he rarely spoke in school in order to avoid attention. He also desperately needed glasses to see, but he refused to wear them in case they also drew attention to him. Because of this, and the fact that his family constantly moved, Richard obviously struggled in school, and he inevitably failed out by the 9th grade. During most of his childhood, Richard's stepfather struggled with alcohol abuse. He was often absent from Richard's life, but when he did show up, he was abusive. This behavior rubbed off on Richard as he started drinking heavily at the age of 12, and by 15, he was getting drunk on a daily basis. When Richard was 20 years old, he met and married a 15-year-old girl named Shirley Annette Malone. He had gotten her pregnant 3 weeks after they met, and they married on January 19th, 1962. According to Shirley, the marriage was a nightmare for her. Richard regularly raped her at knife point and physically abused her. While Shirley was pregnant, Richard got arrested for disturbing the peace while drunk. He had racked up a long list of misdemeanors by the time he was 20, including trespassing and disorderly conduct, but this arrest put him in jail for 22 days. Shirley gave birth to their daughter while Richard was in prison, and separated from him soon after the baby was born. The next year, when Richard was 21, he was arrested and sentenced to 3 years for forgery and burglary. He had apparently forged and cashed a co-worker's check and then robbed a grocery store for cigarettes, beer, and $3 in cash. He was paroled in 1965 after serving 16 months, but was arrested only a week later for attacking a woman in a parking lot and threatening her with a knife. He was convicted of aggravated assault and was sentenced to 16 months, but only served 6. In early 1966, Richard's wife officially filed for divorce. And during that same month, he was arrested again for stabbing a man during a bar fight. He was once again charged with aggravated assault, but his mother hired him a lawyer, and his charge was reduced to disturbing the peace, and he was fined $10. He then refused to pay that $10 and then had to spend 3 days in jail because of it. By the time he attacked the nurses in 1966, Richard had been arrested over 40 times. In early 1966, Richard was living in Monmouth, Illinois, a city over 200 miles from Chicago. While living there, Richard's crimes only continued. He threatened a man in a bar with a knife, and he raped a 65-year-old woman in her own house. In April of 1966, a 32-year-old Monmouth woman named Mary Catherine Pierce was found dead from blunt force trauma. She had last been seen leaving a bar with Richard Speck days before her body was found. Monmouth police questioned Richard, and they told him to stay in town while they conducted their investigation. But the next day, they had found that Richard had fled. Richard traveled to Chicago after fleeing the police and intended to stay with one of his sisters and her husband. Richard told his sister Martha some false story about a crime syndicate being after him, and she let him move in with her, her husband Jean, and their 2 teenage daughters in Irving Park, Chicago, an area about 20 miles north from where the nurses lived. When Richard got to Chicago, he was looking for work, and his sister's husband Jean, who had previously served in the Navy, thought Speck would make a good merchant marine. He took Richard to the Coast Guard to apply, and by the end of April, he was assigned to a lake freighter. Unfortunately, on Richard's first voyage, he was afflicted with appendicitis and had to be evacuated by helicopter. He returned to the ship a month later after he recovered, but was dismissed in June of that year because of a drunken fight he had with an officer on the ship. After he was forced to leave that ship, Jean drove Richard to get a seaman's card from the National Maritime Union hiring hall, which just happened to be located a block east of where 8 nurses lived. On July 12, 1966, Richard was finally assigned to a new ship, the SS St. Clair Great Lakes. But once he arrived at the docks to report, it turned out that the spot had already been filled. Furious, Richard went back to the hiring hall, but by the time he arrived, the hall was closed. The next morning, July 13th, Richard had Martha and Jean drive him back to the hiring hall. At 9 a.m., the couple parked across the street from a townhouse where 8 nurses lived, while they talked to Richard for about 30 minutes before he left the car for the hiring hall. By 10:30 a.m., Richard still had not been seen by a hiring agent, and he was tired of waiting. He left the hall, and with the $25 his sister gave him, he checked into a motel called the Shipyard Inn and spent the rest of the day bar hopping. A 53-year-old woman named Ella Mae Hooper met Richard at one of these bars, and they spent the day together drinking at different establishments. Later in the day, Richard brought Ella back to the inn. He raped her at knife point and then stole her .22 pistol that she had on her. With his switchblade and the gun that he had taken from Ella, Richard made his way out of the inn, had dinner in a nearby restaurant, and then returned to the inn's bar, where he drank until 10:20 p.m. At 10:20 p.m., he left the inn and walked a mile and a half down the block and broke into a street-level window of a townhouse. A townhouse where unsuspecting nursing students were getting ready for bed. On July 14th, 1966, 8 young women were brutally murdered in their dormitory. With the sole survivor giving the police a description of the killer, they were able to release a sketch to the media. With tips from the public pouring in, the police soon identified the man they were looking for as 25-year-old Richard Speck. Richard had been seen by many people complaining about not getting a job on a ship, and police went to the local hiring hall to set a trap. Police knew that Richard Speck was angry about losing his job to someone else, and they figured that maybe they could bait him into showing his face if they had a new one for him. Police had a worker at the hiring hall call the number that Richard had given as his contact information. But instead of Richard, his brother-in-law Gene answered the phone. The hiring agent told Gene that they had a job for Richard on a ship and that he should report to the shipping yard as soon as possible. Gene told the agent that he would go find Richard and tell him about the job right away. A little later, Richard Speck called back the hiring hall. He wanted to confirm the ship he was reporting to. The agent gave him the ship name and told him to report to the docks right away. Now, this was a big mistake on the agent and police's part, because they gave Richard the name of a ship that had already set out to sea days before, and that tipped Richard off that someone was trying to trick him. Police waited by the docks, but Richard never showed. Late that night, police got a call from a local flophouse about a guest carrying a gun. The next morning, on July 15th at 8:30 a.m., 2 police officers went to go check it out. The man with the gun was sleeping when they knocked on his door, and he seemed harmless enough, so police didn't make an official report, but they took the gun from the man. Later that morning, 2 other officers would go to the flophouse to show Richard's sketch to the attendant. And they were informed that the man with the gun they had reported that morning was none other than Richard Speck, and he had just left the building 15 minutes before the police arrived. The police had just missed him, but they would soon get another call that would put them back on his trail. A full day passed without any sign of Speck. But around midnight on July 17th, the police got a call from the Cook County Hospital. A man had arrived by ambulance that evening and appeared to have attempted to take his own life by cutting his wrist and the inside of his elbow with a smashed wine bottle. Dr. Leroy Smith, a 25-year-old surgical resident physician, was examining the man's wounds when he noticed a tattoo on his arm. A tattoo that he had read about earlier that day in the paper. As the doctor read the words, "Born to raise hell," he knew he had the murderer of those 8 nurses in front of him. Dr. Smith alerted the staff to call police and stayed with Richard Speck, who was complaining about needing some water. As 2 officers who were already guarding a different patient came to detain Speck, Richard continued to beg for water. And that's when Dr. Smith grabbed the back of Speck's neck as hard as he could and said, "Did you give water to those nurses?" Within hours, Richard Speck was finally arrested for the murder of the 8 young women. William J. Martin was assigned as the lead investigator. When questioned, Richard Speck claimed that he had no memories of the murders. But that didn't really matter to Martin, because not only did the police have an eyewitness account of his crime, his fingerprints also matched those that had been found at the crime scene. Before his trial, felony court judge Herbert J. Pastian appointed an impartial panel to determine Richard Speck's competence to stand trial and his sanity at the time of the crime. The panel consisted of 3 physicians suggested by the defense and 3 physicians selected by the prosecution. The panel's report said that Speck was in fact competent to stand trial and concluded that he had not been insane at the time of the murders. While he was awaiting trial, Richard Speck saw a psychiatrist at the Cook County Jail twice a week. Richard was diagnosed as a sociopath, with an obsessive-compulsive personality and a Madonna whore attitude towards women. According to the psychiatrist, Richard Speck viewed women as saintly until he felt betrayed by them for some reason. after which he grew angry and violent towards them. On April 3rd, 1967, Richard Speck's trial began, and he was charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder. Because the case was so high profile and the jury had to be impartial, the trial took place 3 hours outside the city of Chicago, and the judge placed a gag order on the press. Days into the trial, a 4'11" Corazon Amaru marched right into the courtroom, impeccably dressed with a determined look on her face, and took to the witness stand. When asked to identify the man who attacked her and her friends, she got up out of her chair, walked right over to Speck, and pointed her finger directly at him. She then recounted the horrible night of July 13th for the court. According to court documents and Corazon's testimony, the night of the attack went as follows. On the evening of July 13th, most of the girls were upstairs in their rooms getting ready for bed. If you remember, the upstairs of the townhouse had 3 bedrooms. According to History.com and All That's Interesting, the girls were divided up 3 and 3 at the time between 2 bedrooms. 3 girls in one bedroom, 3 girls in another. According to the Chicago Tribune, while 8 girls in total lived in the house, only 6 of them were home at this time. At 11 p.m., Corazon says that she was in a bedroom with 2 other Filipino students when there was a knock on her bedroom door. She answers it thinking it's one of the other girls, but instead, she finds Richard Speck outside her bedroom holding a gun. He led Corazon, Merlita Gargiulo, and Valentina Payson at gunpoint to the next bedroom where Patricia Matusik, Pamela Wilkening, and Nina Jo Schmale were sleeping. He woke the other 3 girls up, tore their bedsheets, and tied each of their hands around their back with strips of the material. He sat all 6 girls on the floor and told them that he needed money because he had to travel to New Orleans. Corazon says that Richard was very calm during this, and that signaled to the girls that perhaps if they also remained calm, they would be okay. Because he had a gun, the girls did not resist, and they hoped that if they cooperated, he would just rob them and leave. But unfortunately, that was not the case. After he tied them up, he led the girls out of the second bedroom, one by one, like lambs to the slaughter, as described by the Chicago Tribune. He took Patricia Matusik out of the room first. We know from the crime scene that he took Patricia to the bathroom and strangled her. Corazon says that he came back 20 to 30 minutes later to take the next girl, Pamela Wilkening. He took her to the other bedroom where he stabbed her in the heart and strangled her. Corazon said that he repeated this process over and over. He would take a girl, leave for 20 to 30 minutes, and then come back for another. Corazon says that she didn't hear her friends scream, but she did hear their cries. At one point during the attack, Suzanne Ferris, another nurse who lived at the dorm, came home. She entered the house and walked up the stairs with the intention of getting ready for bed, but instead, she found Richard Speck. In the upstairs hallway, Richard stabbed Suzanne 18 times in the chest and neck and strangled her with a pair of white stockings that were part of the nurses' uniforms. After Suzanne's murder, another girl came home. Mary Ann Jordan did not actually live in the townhouse at this time, but she entered the house a little after Suzanne. She was a nurse at the same hospital, but had recently moved out of the dorm to live with her parents. In a cruel twist of fate, it just happened that Suzanne Ferris was engaged to Mary Ann's brother. And Suzanne asked Mary Ann to sleep over the dorm that night so that they could talk about the upcoming wedding. Mary Ann was immediately stabbed by Richard when she entered the townhouse. At some point during all this, while Richard had his back turned, a still tied up Corazon rolled under one of the beds in the second bedroom. Corazon and the police think that as more girls came back to the dorm, Richard lost count of how many women he had tied up and forgot about Corazon. He killed Nina Schmale, Merlita Gargiulo, and Valentina Payson at some point during the night. Whether it's before or after the two girls arrived home, we are unsure. What we do know is that Richard's final victim was Gloria Jean Davy. Gloria had been on a date that night with her boyfriend. After her boyfriend dropped her off at the dorm, Gloria entered through the front door and was attacked by Richard in the living room. He tied her hands behind her back with the bedsheets, just like the others, tore off all her clothes, and raped her. He then used a piece of bedsheet to strangle her to death on the couch. After killing Gloria, Richard left the townhouse at around 3:30 a.m., spending almost 5 hours in the house. It wasn't until 6 a.m. that Corazon believed that she was safe to call for help. She said that she scrambled from beneath the bed that she was hiding under and screamed out the window to alert the neighbors. Still scared that Richard might be in the house, Corazon climbed out the window and carefully got herself down from the ledge. After hearing the testimony and seeing the fingerprint evidence presented by the police, the jury deliberated for only 49 minutes before making their decision. On April 15th, 1967, Richard Speck was found guilty on all charges. And on June 5th, he was sentenced to death by the electric chair. In June of 1971, Richard Speck appealed his conviction to the Supreme Court. According to court records, Speck's lawyers claimed that over 250 potential jurors were unconstitutionally excluded from his jury because of their conscientious or religious beliefs against capital punishment. While the Supreme Court upheld Speck's conviction in the end, they did take the death penalty off the table because of this. On November 21st, 1972, Speck was resentenced by the Supreme Court of Illinois to 8 consecutive 50 to 150-year sentences, aka 400 to 1,200 years in prison. Now, somehow, Richard Speck was convicted with the possibility of parole, but luckily, no matter how many times he applied for it, he was always denied within minutes. Richard's time in prison was interesting, to say the least. He was called Birdman by fellow inmates because he was known to keep sparrows as pets in his cell. When a prison guard confronted him about the birds and told him that he was not allowed to have pets in his cell, Richard killed the bird right in front of the guard, saying, "If I can't have it, no one can." Richard took various drugs that had been smuggled into the prison, including hormone treatments that allowed him to grow breasts. In a video recording that had been secretly filmed in the prison in the 1980s, Richard can be seen with woman-like breasts, doing large amounts of cocaine, and performing sex acts with other inmates. At one point in the tape, someone asks Richard if he really killed those nurses, to which he responds, "Sure I did. It just wasn't their night." He was also heard saying, "If they only knew how much fun I was having, they'd turn me loose." Richard's fun would come to an end on December 5th, 1991, however, when he died of a heart attack in prison. Richard Speck became infamous for this crime. But I want to end this episode by remembering the victims who so often get forgotten. The 8 young women who were planning on dedicating their lives to helping others. Gloria Jean Davy was born in Illinois and was one of 5 siblings. In high school, she was the head of the cheerleading squad and named a Future Farmers of America sweetheart. She was president of the Student Nurses Association of Illinois from 1965 to 1966, and she was often described as a leader. Mary Ann Jordan loved sports, like swimming, ice skating, softball, baseball, and even roller skating. She was one of 6 children, but had a special connection with her youngest brother who had Down syndrome. Her grandmother was a very successful surgical nurse, and Mary Ann was following in her footsteps. Suzanne Ferris was actually planning her wedding to Mary Ann's brother before she was taken from this world. Her romantic nature probably came from her father, who was going to be a priest after attending seminary school, but fell in love with Suzanne's mother and chose to be with her instead. Valentina Payson also known as Tina to her family, had come from the Philippines to pursue a career in nursing. Her confidence in such a big move probably came from the fact that she had graduated in the top 10 of her class at Manila Central University. Patricia Ann Matusik witnessed her 15-year-old cousin die in a hospital when she was 14. And ever since then, she knew she wanted to become a nurse. She was described as sweet, assertive, funny, and full of life. Merlita Gargiulo was the first in her village to go to America. In the spring of 1966, she left the Philippines to join the Chicago Nursing School. She was known to send any money she made back home to her family, and had a beautiful singing voice. Pamela Wilkening was the most studious of her friends. She was quiet and serious, and worked as a part-time baker when she wasn't at nursing school. She was actually supposed to go home the weekend of the murders, but decided to stay back so she could study for exams. Nina Jo Schmale volunteered at a local elderly care facility, where she was very close with the patients. She was even said to bring them all Christmas presents around the holidays. The sole survivor of the attack, Corazon Amaru, returned to her home of the Philippines after Speck's trial. She eventually married and had children, and moved back to the US, where she became a nurse at Georgetown University Hospital, finally fulfilling the dream that Speck stole from so many of her friends. Corazon is now in her 80s, and still keeps in touch with the victims' families to this day.
This episode was written by Alexa Morrissey, researched by Victoria Cox, and produced by Michael Morrissey, John Scassia, and Heidi Sherman. Stranger in the House is a Boy Wonder production. You can follow us at strangerinthehouse.com, @_strangerinthehouse on Instagram and TikTok, and @_strangerpod on Twitter. Stay safe, and thanks for listening.